A city that never sleeps. The sun rises over Constantinople like a slow-burning coin. It climbs past the blue water of the Bosporus, past the ships creaking at their moorings, past the gulls arguing over scraps of yesterday's bread. The city yawns and stretches, shaking off sleep with the clatter of hooves and the call of market vendors. Spices wake the air. Bread warms in stone ovens. Somewhere, a church bell clears its throat and begins to sing. This is a city that believes it is the center of the world, and honestly, it might be right. Gold gleams from domes. Marble pillars rise like proud soldiers. The great hippodrome roars to life, already hungry for the next race, the next riot, the next bit of gossip. Constantinople runs on three things: faith, fortune, and a good, juicy scandal. And nothing creates scandal quite like a powerful woman. Behind the heavy curtains of the imperial palace, beneath ceilings painted with saints and emperors, sits an empress who makes senators nervous and priests uneasy. She listens more than she speaks. She watches more than she moves. When she finally does speak, grown men suddenly find the floor very interesting. Her name is Theodora. Some call her a saint, some call her a sinner. Most call her dangerous. They whisper that she saved an empire with nothing but her backbone and a sharp tongue. They whisper that she rules from the shadows, guiding the hand of the emperor himself. They whisper that she remembers every insult, every enemy, every debt unpaid. But long before she wore silk and pearls, long before mosaics captured her face in glittering gold, she was something very different. Once, she was just a little girl, trying to survive in a hard, noisy, unforgiving world. To understand the Empress, you have to begin far from the throne. You have to begin where she began. Born in the dust. Born in the dust. Before there was purple silk, there was dirt under her fingernails. Before there were crowns and councils and men trembling at her voice, there was a small house near the hippodrome where the walls were thin and the future even thinner. Theodora arrived in this world without fanfare, without trumpets, without a single person imagining she would someday change history. Her father worked as a bearkeeper for the circus games, a job that sounded impressive until you realized it mostly meant long hours, low pay, and the constant smell of nervous animals. Her mother patched clothes, stretched coins, and prayed to saints who never seemed to answer fast enough. They were not starving, not exactly, but they lived one bad week away from disaster, like most families in Constantinople who didn't have a fancy name to hide behind. As a child, Theodora learned the music of the city early. She knew the rhythm of the streets, the vendors shouting, the gamblers laughing, the roar of the crowd when chariots flew around the track. She learned that applause could be louder than thunder and disappear just as fast. Then, just when life was steady enough to feel almost safe, her father died, and the ground fell out from under them. In a heartbeat, the family slid from poor to desperate. A bearkeeper's widow with daughters to feed had very few choices, and none of them were kind. Theodora watched her mother beg for help, watched doors close, watched powerful men look through them as if they were invisible. That was the first lesson she tucked into her young heart. The world respects strength. It ignores weakness, and it eats the helpless alive. So she learned not to be helpless. She learned to be sharp. She learned to be observant. She learned to survive. Opportunity came knocking in an unlikely costume: sequins, makeup, and stage lights. The theater. And Theodora, still barely more than a girl, stepped into a life that would save her and scar her all at once. From stage to survival. The stage in Constantinople glittered like a dream. To the crowd it was music and laughter, swirling dancers and bright costumes. To the girls behind the curtain, it was something very different: hard work, long nights, and the constant understanding that applause didn't pay nearly as well as powerful attention. Theodora became an actress because she had to eat. There were no fairy tales about it, no noble ambitions, just a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly into poverty. She learned how to command a room. She learned how to hold a gaze. She learned how to turn laughter into armor. On stage, she could be anything: goddess, clown, queen, villain. Offstage, she was still a poor girl from the wrong side of the city, doing whatever it took to survive another day. The world judged actresses harshly. Respectable society called them immoral, dangerous, unfit. Men cheered them in the theatre and insulted them in the streets. The same crowd that applauded her performances would never dream of inviting her to dinner. Theodora noticed all of it. She stored it away. Every sneer, every promise broken, every reminder of how fragile a woman's safety could be. But something else was happening too. Beneath the makeup and the gossip, she was growing into herself. She was learning the secret language of power, how to read people, how to sense weakness, how to survive in a world that preferred women silent and small. By the time she was a young woman, Theodora understood one brutal truth. Life was a stage, and most people never got to choose their role. She decided she would. And just when it seemed her path was set forever, just when everyone thought they had her neatly labeled and boxed away, Theodora did something no one expected. She left. She walked away from the noise, the lights, the hungry eyes, and the narrow future everyone assumed she would accept. The next chapter of her life would not be written in Constantinople at all, and when she returned, she would not return as the same woman. The long road away. Most people assume lives move in straight lines. Poor child becomes poor adult. Actress becomes forgotten actress. Yesterday decides tomorrow. Theodora had already learned that straight lines were for people with no imagination. So she packed up what little she owned, folded away her old life like a worn costume, and left Constantinople behind. No trumpets, no farewell party, just a young woman stepping onto the long, uncertain road with nothing but nerve and stubborn hope. She traveled east, south, anywhere the wind and opportunity pushed her. Egypt, North Africa, the wide, warm edges of the empire where the streets smelled different and the sky felt bigger. Out there, far from the gossiping crowds of the hippodrome, she discovered a new version of herself. No one knew her name. No one cared about her past. No one expected anything from her. For the first time in her life, she could breathe. She listened to new ideas. She met scholars and priests and women who had suffered in ways she understood all too well. She learned about faith that spoke of mercy instead of mockery. She saw how power worked in different cities, different courts, different cultures. Slowly, quietly, she began to change. The sharp-tongued stage girl softened into something deeper, thoughtful, watchful, wiser than her years. She learned to measure her words instead of throwing them. She learned patience, the kind that sits back and waits for the perfect moment to move. The world had tried to harden her. Instead, it forged her. And somewhere along that dusty, sunlit road, Theodora made a decision. She would not let her beginning decide her ending. So, after years away, after enough time to let old scandals fade and old enemies forget, she turned her face back toward the city she had once fled. Constantinople waited. It had no idea what was coming home to it. Return of a different woman. Theodora walked back into the capital as if stepping onto a stage she already knew by heart. But this time, she carried herself differently. Her shoulders were straighter, her eyes steadier, her voice calm in a way it had never been before. The city remembered her only as an actress with a questionable reputation. They expected the same loud laughter, the same reckless energy. Instead, they found a woman sharpened by experience and polished by time. She kept to herself, she chose her company carefully, she spoke less and listened more. And people began to notice something curious. The wild girl they thought they knew had disappeared. In her place stood someone new, and in a twist of fate that history loves to giggle about, that new woman soon crossed paths with a rising political star named Justinian. He was clever, ambitious, hungry for greatness. She was brilliant, observant, unimpressed by titles. The moment they met, the world tilted a little. He saw in her a mind as quick as his own. She saw in him a ladder tall enough to reach the sky. Their connections startled everyone, especially the polite, proper society that believed a man of Justinian's future should never look twice at a woman of Theodora's past. But love, like power, rarely asks permission. They talked for hours. They argued. They laughed. She challenged him. He listened. In a court filled with flattering voices, hers was the only one brave enough to tell him the truth. Justinian realized something dangerous and wonderful. He didn't just want her, he needed her. There was only one problem. The law said he could never marry a woman like Theodora. The church frowned. The nobles sneered. Tradition folded its arms and said, absolutely not. Theodora had heard no her entire life. She was not impressed by it now. And Justinian, stubborn, powerful, and utterly in love, decided that if the rules stood in their way, then the rules would simply have to move.
A forbidden marriage.
In Constantinople, rules were carved into marble, and tradition was stitched into every royal robe. And right in the middle of it all stood Justinian and Theodora, two people who had the audacity to fall in love where love was not supposed to exist. To the nobles of the empire, it was unthinkable. A future emperor marrying a former actress, a woman with a past everyone pretended to be scandalized by. The court gasped. The clergy coughed politely into their sleeves. The aristocrats clutched their pearls like they might faint dead away. There were laws, after all, very important laws, old laws, respectable laws that said a man of Justinian's rank could never, under any circumstances, marry a woman like her. Theodora listened to all of this with a calm little smile. She had spent her entire life being told where she belonged. She had no intention of agreeing with anyone now. Justinian, meanwhile, had made up his mind. He did not want a quiet, obedient bride. He did not want a political decoration. He wanted a partner, someone who understood the world as sharply as he did. He wanted Theodora. So, he did what powerful men do when the rules annoy them. He changed the rules. With the stroke of an imperial pen and the backing of his uncle, the reigning emperor, the law was rewritten. Suddenly, quite miraculously, a nobleman could marry a woman of humble origins. Imagine that. The city buzzed like an overturned beehive. Some called it romantic, some called it outrageous, most called it a disaster waiting to happen. The wedding itself was elegant, proper, dripping with ceremony, and humming with gossip. Theodora walked through the palace halls as a bride, while half the court watched her with narrowed eyes, already predicting her downfall. She didn't stumble. She didn't apologize. She didn't shrink. She simply took Justinian's hand and stepped into her new life as if she had always known it was coming. But marriage to a rising star was only the beginning, because history, with its perfect sense of timing, had something much bigger in mind: the throne. Crowned Empress. When Justinian became emperor, the bells of Constantinople rang until the sound seemed to live in the stones. Crowds filled the streets, priests chanted blessings, soldiers saluted. The empire celebrated a new ruler, strong and confident, ready to lead them into glory. And beside him stood Theodora. Not behind him, not beneath him, beside him. The crown settled onto her dark hair, heavy with jewels and expectations. Silk wrapped around shoulders that had once carried baskets and mended costumes. Gold shimmered where poverty used to live. In that moment, a poor girl from the dusty edges of the hippodrome became Empress of the Roman Empire. It should have felt like a fairy tale, but Theodora knew better than to believe in fairy tales. From the first day of Justinian's reign, she made one thing perfectly clear. She would not be a silent ornament on the throne. She would not smile and nod and leave the hard decisions to the men. She had survived too much to sit quietly now. She attended councils. She listened to arguments. She spoke her mind. At first, the court treated her like an amusing experiment, a former actress playing dress-up in imperial purple. Surely she would fade into the background once the novelty wore off. Instead, she grew sharper. She learned the names and secrets of every powerful family. She studied the tangled web of politics like a chessboard. She understood something many emperors never quite grasped. Real power rarely shouts. It whispers and waits. Justinian might have worn the crown, but everyone in the palace quickly realized an undeniable truth. The emperor ruled the empire. Theodora ruled the emperor. Some feared her, some admired her. Most did a healthy mixture of both. And just as the court was beginning to understand how formidable she truly was, Constantinople erupted into chaos. Fire, riots, revolution in the streets. The empire would soon face its greatest test. And in that storm, Theodora would prove once and for all that she was not merely an empress, she was the backbone of an empire.
The Nika riots, trial by fire. Power always looks tidy from a distance. Up close, it is loud, messy, and sometimes soaked in smoke. 5 years into Justinian's reign, Constantinople exploded. It started, as so many disasters do, with something small: angry sports fans, bitter politics, and a crowd already hungry for trouble. The Blues and the Greens, rival chariot teams with loyal followers, began shouting insults. Insults turned to fists. Fists turned to torches. Before anyone realized what was happening, the city was on fire. Streets filled with shouting mobs, buildings burned like giant candles. The hippodrome thundered with one word over and over again: Nika, Nika, victory, victory. It became a roar aimed straight at the palace. The people wanted Justinian gone. They wanted a new emperor. They wanted blood, change, chaos, anything but the life they had. Inside the palace walls, fear spread faster than the flames outside. Advisors panicked, senators whispered, generals argued. Justinian himself, the mighty emperor, looked at the growing madness and felt his confidence crack. He talked of escape, of fleeing the city, of abandoning the throne to save his life. And that is when Theodora stood up. Picture the scene: a room full of powerful men, sweating and trembling, arguing about ships and safe routes and how quickly they could run away. Then her voice cuts through them like a blade, calm, clear, unshakable. Anyone can flee, she tells them, but I will not. She reminds them that purple, the color of royalty, makes a fine burial shroud. In other words, better to die an empress than live as a coward. The room falls silent. In that moment, Theodora does not look like a former actress or a controversial wife or a woman anyone once dismissed. She looks like steel. Her courage stiffens Justinian's spine. Orders are given, troops are rallied, generals are unleashed into the streets. By the time the smoke clears, the riots are crushed, thousands lie dead, and the throne stands secure. The empire survives, not because Justinian was brave, but because Theodora refused to be afraid. From that day on, no one in Constantinople ever doubted her again. The empress who ruled from the shadows.
After the riots, Theodora's shadow stretched long across the empire. Officially, Justinian ruled. Unofficially, everyone knew who truly held the reins. She never needed to shout. She didn't need grand speeches or public displays. Her power lived in quiet rooms, in late-night conversations, in carefully chosen words dropped into the right ears. She understood something most rulers never do. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. Theodora became the invisible hand guiding an entire civilization. She pushed for laws that protected women, real laws with teeth. She fought to end human trafficking. She created shelters for women with nowhere to go. She demanded that abuse be punished and dignity be defended. For the first time, the empire treated poor women like people instead of problems. She remembered exactly where she had come from, and she refused to let others suffer the way she once had. The nobles hated it. The old families muttered behind painted smiles. The church eyed her with suspicion. Let them, she seemed to say. Theodora had no interest in being liked. She cared about being effective. Foreign ambassadors learned quickly not to underestimate her. Generals discovered that her memory was long and her patience longer. Enemies who crossed her found themselves suddenly out of favor, out of power, or quietly out of the picture. She didn't need a sword. Her mind was sharper than any blade. While Justinian dreamed of grand buildings and glorious wars, Theodora focused on people, on justice, order, and the fragile human lives caught underneath the wheels of empire. Together, They ruled like two halves of one fierce machine. But everyone in the palace understood the truth. Justinian wore the crown. Theodora carried its weight. And in the golden corridors of Constantinople, beneath the glitter and incense and politics, an extraordinary reality had taken shape. A woman who began with nothing now shaped the fate of millions, without ever needing to stand in the spotlight. She ruled not with noise, but with will. An empress of silk and iron, an empress of the shadows.
Enemies in silk robes. Power has a funny way of collecting enemies. The moment Theodora proved she could save an empire, she also proved something else. She was not a woman to be pushed aside. And in a court filled with men who enjoyed pushing women aside, that made her extremely inconvenient. On the surface, everyone bowed. Deep bows, polite bows, bowing so graceful it looked like an art form. Underneath those silk sleeves, knives waited. The old noble families hated her most of all. To them, she was an insult wrapped in imperial purple, a reminder that bloodlines and titles could be overturned by a stubborn girl with brains and backbone. They whispered about her past. They rolled their eyes at her reforms. They called her meddlesome, dangerous, improper. Theodora heard every word. She simply kept ruling. Church leaders eyed her with suspicion too. She supported beliefs and priests they didn't always approve of. She cared more about mercy than tradition, more about protecting the powerless than protecting the pride of powerful men. That made her troublesome. Troublesome women, history likes to point out, are rarely forgiven. But Theodora had learned long ago that forgiveness was overrated. She built networks of loyal supporters. She promoted people who earned her trust instead of inheriting it. She played the court like a finely tuned instrument, knowing exactly when to flatter, when to threaten, and when to sit quietly while her enemies tangled themselves up. One by one, the men who underestimated her discovered how sharp her memory could be. A senator who mocked her found his influence fading. A general who defied her found himself conveniently reassigned. A rival who spread rumors suddenly discovered the emperor no longer returned his invitations. Nothing loud, nothing obvious, just small, elegant reminders of who truly held the reins. Theodora did not forgive easily. She did not forget at all. And yet, for all the battles she fought in marble halls and velvet chambers, there was one relationship that mattered more than all the rest. The one man who stood beside her through every storm. Love, faith, and power. If the empire was a great, complicated machine, then Justinian and Theodora were its twin engines. Their marriage baffled people. Some called it scandalous. Some called it political theatre. A few brave souls called it what it truly was, an extraordinary partnership. They argued like equals. They planned like generals. They trusted each other in a world where trust was as rare as honest flattery. Justinian dreamed big. He wanted to rebuild the Roman Empire, to cover the world in grand buildings and shining laws. His mind reached for glory the way other men reached for bread. Theodora kept his feet on the ground. Where he saw monuments, she saw people. Where he thought about conquests, she thought about consequences. Faith tied them together in complicated knots. Justinian saw himself as God's chosen ruler, a man destined to restore Christian greatness. Theodora believed deeply as well, but her faith was gentler, more human, more forgiving. They didn't always agree. Sometimes their disagreements shook the palace walls. But beneath the politics and the arguments lived a fierce, unbreakable loyalty. He trusted her judgment when his own wavered. She trusted his vision when the future felt uncertain. In a world that had tried to break them both in different ways, they found in each other something rare, a true ally. Their enemies sneered that she controlled him. Theodora never bothered to deny it. Why should she? Power was not a game she played for appearances. It was a tool to shape the world, and she intended to use it. Together, they rebuilt cities, rewrote laws, and steered an empire through wars, plagues, and endless political storms. Together, they stood at the very center of history, two unlikely partners holding a trembling world in their hands. And yet, even the strongest alliances face one enemy no crown can defeat: time.
Theodora had risen from nothing. She had saved a throne. She had ruled an empire from the shadows. But no woman, no matter how brilliant, how fierce, how powerful, can bargain forever with fate. The final act waited quietly in the wings.
The final curtain. Empires like to pretend they are eternal. They build walls of stone and domes of gold and write laws that sound permanent. They convince themselves that power can outlive anything. But time has never cared much for crowns. After years of ruling beside Justinian, after riots and reforms, enemies and triumphs, Theodora's body began to betray her. The woman who had faced down angry mobs and snarling senators found herself fighting a quieter, more relentless opponent: illness. The palace grew hushed around her. Doctors came and went with serious faces. Priests whispered prayers. Courtiers, who once feared her, now waited anxiously for news, because even they understood the truth. Constantinople without Theodora would not be the same city. She faced her final days the way she had faced everything else, with dignity, with courage, with that unbreakable spine that had carried her from the dust to the throne. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic last stand, just a slow fading of a brilliant, stubborn light. In the year 548, the Empress of Shadows closed her eyes for the last time. Justinian was devastated. The man who had rebuilt the empire brick by brick suddenly felt as if the ground beneath him had turned fragile. He ruled for decades more, built wonders like the great Hagia Sophia, wrote laws that shaped civilizations, yet those close to him said he was never quite whole again. Theodora had not just been his wife, she had been his compass. Without her, the palace felt colder, the throne heavier, the world far less certain. Her enemies celebrated quietly. Her supporters mourned openly. The city that had once whispered about her now whispered something very different. We will not see her kind again. The curtain fell on her life, but not on her story. Because some women are too powerful to disappear. History is written by men, with long memories and sharp opinions. And many of those men never forgave Theodora for existing on her own terms. Writers tried to paint her as wicked, manipulative, immoral, a dangerous woman who climbed too high. They sharpened their pens and smeared her name, hoping to shrink her legacy down to something easier to swallow. It didn't work. Too much evidence stood in their way. Laws that protected women, shelters that saved the desperate, a city rebuilt after disaster, an empire preserved when it should have fallen. Mosaics in Ravenna still shine with her image. Theodora frozen in gold and jewels, eyes steady, chin lifted, surrounded by attendants who seem to fade beside her. Even in tiny colored tiles, her presence is impossible to ignore. Generations later, people still argue about her. Was she ruthless? Probably. Was she ambitious? Absolutely. Was she a saint? Not even close. But she was something far more interesting. She was a woman who refused to accept the limits the world tried to place on her. A girl born in poverty who stood in the center of an empire. A dismissed actress who saved a throne. A scandal who became a legend. Theodora proved that beginnings do not have to dictate endings. She proved that power can wear a woman's face. She proved that courage sometimes comes wrapped in silk. And most of all, she proved that history may try to decide who matters, but every once in a while, a fierce, impossible woman stands up and decides for herself. Centuries have passed, empires have crumbled, cities have risen and fallen, yet her name still survives. Theodora, Empress, Reformer, Survivor, the woman who came from the shadows and made the whole world remember her. If you felt the fire in her spirit and the iron in her spine, don't let her story fade back into the shadows. History is full of women who refused the cage, who learned to bite back, and who left their footprints on the world so the rest of us could walk a little taller. Subscribe as we continue to exhume the lives of the dark heroines. Next time,
We leave the marble halls of Constantinople and ride east into the burning sands of the ancient world. We're meeting a queen who dared to stare Rome straight in the eye and say, "Try me." She built her own empire, crowned herself ruler, and made emperors tremble. Next time, Zenobia, the queen who defied Rome. Stay dangerous, stay loud, and never let them hold the pen.